Well, we talked about kind of the foundation of Christian ethics, but now we're going to talk about where do we actually get the, the principles and the standards for ethics in the first place. That is to say, how do we know what is right and what is wrong? And two of the kind of great ethical systems that have been put forth to give an answer to this question have been ethical systems of consequences or consequentialism and also principle ethics. And we're going to talk about those two in our session today. Now, in terms of consequentialist ethics, basically what is happening here is you begin with the end in mind. The concern here is about results. Okay? And one of the systems that is under this consequentialist view is called ethical egoism. And basically the idea is do what is best for yourself. That ethically, the claim is that we act in self-interest. And therefore, because we act in self-interest, the moral way to act is to do what is best for you. Now, Christians often will react immediately to this by saying, no, that's not correct. We're supposed to do what's best for others. But there is actually a potential basis for this in Scripture itself. For example, in Deuteronomy 27 and through 30, God gives the Israelites a series of what are called blessings and cursings. And in this passage, basically God is appealing to their self-interest. He's saying, look, if you obey me, I will bless you. But if you disobey me, it's not going to go well for you. So it's in your best interest to do what I tell you to do so that life will be better for you. So in a sense, this gives nod to the idea and the reality that we often do things for our own best interest and for our own well-being. And this is part of the self-preservation. It's part of a kind of built-in survivalist mentality that it seems to be part of human nature. And I don't think that it's all necessarily inherently wrong. But of course, it does have a tendency to rub us the wrong way, and there's a reason for that. We're going to look at some of the evaluative rationales for why people tend to, at least especially for Christians, not look to ethical egoism for its system of ethics. First of all, you have the problem of what we call altruistic acts and the biblical call to selfless love. What are altruistic acts? Well, basically, sometimes they're called supererogatory acts. They're actions that we do that are considered moral, but they're not actually in our best interest. They're actually in the best interest of others. So, for example, just to kind of share a historical example, about almost 20 years ago now, some terrorists flew airplanes into the World Trade Center towers in New York. And in the midst of that event, there were firefighters who had to go into the burning buildings to try to rescue people who were in those buildings. And it was not in their personal best interest to do so. Personal best interest would have been for them to run and flee for their lives. But their sense of moral duty was that I am a firefighter, I am here to help others, and I am going to run into this burning building, knowing very well it could cost me my life, but I'm going to do this because it is the right thing to do. Now, that sense of duty is not really accounted for in ethical egoism. So we have a problem with ethics, because ethics needs to account for all kinds of ethical expectations and behaviors. And if they don't account for them, then there's an inadequacy or even a fallacy in that ethical system. Another problem is what we call conflicts of interest. Sometimes it's in my best interest to make it more difficult for somebody else. I mean, in an extreme case, you could say it's in my best interest to kill everyone and to take everything for myself so that I can have an abundance of resources. And that, on the surface of it, is clearly immoral. So conflicts of interest have to deal with and wrestle with, and a good moral system has to be able to say, why should I sacrifice for myself for the sake of another in order for the well-being of all? And ethical egoism doesn't do a very good job of helping with that. And of course, there's also this potential justification and encouragement of selfishness. Ultimately, the idea is, I want to do what's best for me. And it really does encourage selfishness. It makes selfishness into a virtue, in a sense. And most people would not consider selfishness a virtue. And finally, there's a failure to appreciate the important cooperative and interdependent aspects of human life. That is to say, it's not all about me. That we actually do better in community with one another when we make sacrifices for the sake of the other in our midst. That we make sacrifices and give up certain things so that the community can thrive and survive better. So the reality is that ethical egoism doesn't give us an adequate, holistic view of the ethical life. Now, what about utilitarianism, sometimes also called consequentialism? This is another competing theory within consequentialist ethics that basically says you need to look for the greatest good for the greatest number. John Stuart Mill was one of their great advocates, and basically the idea is that you look at the end result, and whatever gets you to that end result is okay. And again, the idea of Hebrews 12:2 is that Jesus goes to the cross, what? Despising the shame and all that he has to go through for the joy set before him, in that he knows going to the cross, through the cross, will accomplish redemption. So it is ultimately the great act of utility, the cross, so that the greatest number can benefit. Now, I think that's probably a bit of a stretch, but I want to try to be as fair as I can to give biblical support. There's two main types of this utilitarianism. One is act utilitarianism, and it's basically looking for what actions specifically are what things will typically produce greater good for the most number of people. And that looks for specific acts. Rule utilitarianism looks for kind of general rule, structural kind of systemic rules that when they are followed, more people tend to benefit than when other things are done or other rules are made. So these are kind of some of the ethical, again, we're not going to go into any kind of major detail here because an entire class can be taught on these ethical systems. But I want you to be aware of them, and then we're going to give just a very, very quick critique. First of all, we do want to commend this in that we do need to be concerned about the outcome. In other words, we do want to ask the question, what is likely to happen if I do this? I don't want to be kind of ignorant of or to ignore or deny that there may be consequences for what I do. And in many ways, ethics asks the important question, what will be the result of this? And is that going to be a good thing or not? So we should be concerned about and do ethical life with the end in mind. However, the problem here is that we are finite, and ethical life is sometimes very complex. And we do not have an omniscience. We do not have all knowledge. So the ability for us to foresee what the future impact will be very, very hard for us. In fact, in some ways, it's almost impossible. For example, how are we going to know if something is going to have a good outcome, and for how long even? Like, for example, you could say having sex with my girlfriend if I'm a single man, feels good, and it binds us and bonds us together. And so, hey, it's a good thing because the result is positive feelings toward one another. But for how long? If that continues, does that eventually lead to very negative consequences? But how would that be measured if we did not have some sort of external standard outside of the kind of mere pleasure of the moment? So a lot of the problem is we do not have the kinds of resources that are needed for us to really know what the long-term ramifications are for certain behaviors. We need an outside resource that has all knowledge, that has the ability to make these kinds of evaluations. And we just don't have all the resources necessary. Third, the problem of competing ethical values is a big problem here, because just like as in ethical egoism, you have the same sorts of questions about, okay, maybe it's the greatest good for the greatest number, but what about the people who it's not good for? Do they have any rights? For example, you could easily justify, I'm trying to think of a good, okay. You could deal with overpopulation, which is a problem in some places. You could deal with it by just eliminating everybody who's poor or mentally incapacitated. That would be a kind of a simple solution, and everyone else, the vast majority of people, would benefit from not having to take care of. We saw this law recently taking effect in one of the European countries where babies who have Down syndrome and who are found to have Down syndrome through through genetic testing, they're supposed to be aborted because they're a burden on society, because the greatest good is for those who don't have these genetic defects to be benefited from not having to allocate resources to those who are not, quote, unquote, perfect. So you can begin to see how consequentialist ethics can really justify some terrible things, evil things, in the name of the good for the majority. And the other thing is that you do, at the end of the day, tend to let the ends justify the means. So, for example, I could say, as a politician, I'm going to lie and cheat so that I can be elected into office, and then, being elected into office and giving power, I can make a difference for the good. You see, the ends in this case justifies the means, and that makes the ends and the means just in consequentialist ethics. But in adequate understanding of ethics, it's not just the ends that matter, it's also the means. So that getting to the end needs to be done in an ethical manner, not just justifying the end in an unethical manner to get to the ethical end, at least the perceived ethical end. And that is a major problem with this system of ethics. Now, the fifth and final one here is the failure to recognize that some actions are inherently good regardless of the outcomes they produce. In other words, there are times when doing the right thing will actually result in harm or hard things, difficulties, hardships. But they're the right thing to do. And so that even though the ends seem unpleasant or bad, the end isn't the main concern. It is what is right to do in this situation. So, for example, I'll give you an example. In China, if I find out I'm a husband with my wife and we already have 2 children, let's just say, because now that China's policy allows for 2 children in some cases, whereas before it was only 1. But let's say now that I have 2 children already, and then suddenly find out my wife is pregnant. Now, the ends justify the means could say, well, it's permitted and highly encouraged, in fact demanded by the government, that we abort this baby. Now, again, you could say, well, let's say I'm a Christian minister, and if I don't abort the baby, it's going to probably cost me a great deal of money and respect. It's even going to cost me perhaps my position in society, and that this child will never be given a legitimate identity card and the benefits of education and other things based upon the way the system works in China. So that the easiest thing in the world is to say, just get rid of the baby. But that's an immoral decision, because that baby is a child. It deserves to live, even if life will be harder as a result, and even if there will be many negative consequences. So the right thing to do in this situation may result in many hardships, but it's still the right thing to do. And utilitarianism does not have an adequate accounting of how we can determine those things, because it's only concerned with the ends. It doesn't really look at the means and doesn't really give us a foundation for determining what means are appropriate and moral. Now, for Christians, a lot of us will be most comfortable with what we call principle ethics, this idea that there are things that are inherently right and wrong. Some things are right, some things are wrong, and we determine those things based upon, for Christianity, for the Bible. And we will be very comfortable with this. Of course, we have passages like the Ten Commandments. We have passages like the Sermon on the Mount that give these kind of moral principles and statements of this is right, this is wrong, you shall not, and you should do this. And these kinds of very duty-centered principle ethics are typically called deontological, because they are what they call duty-centered. Deon comes from the Greek word for duty. In other words, you do something because it's right, not because it benefits you or because it has a certain right or beneficial or desirable outcome, but simply because inherent within it is the nature of goodness, of rightness. Now, the idea so that some moral actions are inherently right and wrong regardless of their context. Now, because of that, we are obligated to do what is right and refrain from what is wrong. We have a duty. We are bound by that duty to do what is right. Now, can we evaluate this? Yes. Because one of the big problems with this is discerning the truly foundational principles. What is truly right and what is truly wrong, and especially in the complicated nature of life and discerning these foundational principles, how do I actually determine them? And sometimes they're not as obvious as you think they should be. And that tends to make our job more difficult. There are some things that are quite obvious, but there are other things that aren't so quite so obvious. And another thing that's interesting about this, because we tend to see these things as having inherent rightness and wrongness, we tend to universalize them. And what that does is it kind of secularizes and depersonalizes them. What do I mean by that is that we detach those principles from their source in God. In other words, we say they're right for everywhere and everyone at all times. And that may be true, but by doing that, detaching them, we give them almost a sense of absolute, that the principles themselves become idols and absolutes, rather than God grounding them in the character and personal loving nature of God. And they actually become, as we're going to see in a minute, they become more like legalism. They become so important that people care more about the rights and the wrongs than they care about relationships. And they care about the nature of why are those things right and wrong, and what is the foundation and basis for calling them right and wrong. So again, another problem is we need that relational empowerment. These principles oftentimes are very hard to fulfill. And in many ways, God's demands of us are greater than our capacity. And so we need God to give us His Holy Spirit in order for us to fulfill these. And so to expect them to be fulfilled in the non-Christian and in the one who does not have the Spirit of God can be problematic. And that's where the distinct nature of Christian ethics begins to come into question about, well, what things are truly universal and what things are only distinct and expected of Christians. It's possible to discern that. It's possible to differentiate that, but it becomes more complex, and it is not as straightforward or simple as we might think at first. And then the fourth thing is, as I mentioned, there's a tendency to legalism. You begin to look, okay, I just want to know what's right, and I just want to know what's wrong. Just give me the list. Tell me how high the skirt can be, or tell me that I need to cover this part of my body, or tell me that I need to just go to church every week for 2 hours, and then I fulfilled what God expects of me. Again, you begin to make rules and regulations more important than a sense of relationship with God and relationship with others. And this legalism overtakes and obscures the true nature of the law. The law is intended for our good. It's intended to draw us into relationship with God and into harmonious relationships with one another. But it can become a source in some situations, because our sin is so good at distorting even that which is good, that we can become angry and bitter and unpleasant in our rule keeping. And I'm sure you've all met people like this, even within the Christian community. They're just so unpleasant. They're just so judgmental, and they're just always condemning everything and everyone. And they've missed the heart and the spirit of love that goes behind God's prohibitions, that God is love. And these standards and these rules are held to us not to just be sources of judgment and anger, but to actually empower and cause us to flourish. So legalism really destroys that. And then, of course, the crucial role of character and virtue. Because there are situations where principles compete with one another. And how do I know which one is the one to apply? How do I know what is the right thing to do in this situation, given the fact that there may be competing moral principles, and I don't actually know which one should take precedence? Virtue and character and wisdom are some of the things that we need in those situations that go beyond mere knowledge of principles to actually have a sense of what is the loving and right and good thing to do in this situation. The number 6 thing is to competing norms. Just the same idea. Life is complex, and sometimes there are norms that compete with one another, and we don't necessarily know what is right if we just have principles to guide us. Now, I'm going to argue then that consequences, although they should be paid attention to and do matter, and the principles that we look to for right and wrong, while important, incredibly foundational for our life in moral concern, they're inadequate. And they're inadequate because they do not give us that contextual wisdom that we need to know which principles are most important in this situation, which take precedent, and why. And even though we need to be concerned about the end, there's more that we need to be concerned about in terms of relationships and in terms of concern for one another and for our relationship and intimacy with God. So we're going to talk about that in the next section with respect to what has been deemed virtue or character ethics.